Thank you for checking out Scotty's Hobbies. Today we're looking at a 2016 Nissan Altima. We're going to be replacing the rear pads and rotors on this vehicle. This will be the same, if not very similar, to many other vehicles that will be listed in the description below. First off, let's take a good look at what we need to touch or what we need to remove to get the job done. On this vehicle, for sure, it needs rotors. If you're going to check the emergency brake or parking brake, that assembly is inside the rotor when you remove it. So, come around to the back, let's see what we need. To remove the caliper from the bracket, you're going to need a 14mm socket, preferably a 6-point. And to remove the caliper bracket from the spindle, you're going to need a 19mm preferable 6-point socket. First, to remove the caliper itself from the bracket, this is going to be a 14mm on the slider pin. Let's go ahead and remove these first. Loosen them up, then you should be able to get them all the way out with your fingers with no problems. Kind of make sure I get you the perfect view or the perfect lighting, so it's a little adjustment right there. Remove the slider pins, set them off to the side, somewhere where you're not going to lose them or they're going to get dirty or anything like that. Soon we're going to clean them off and re-lube them before we assemble them, and also make sure you use proper torque specifications when installing as well. If you find one of your slider pins seized or you can't pull it out easily or spin it easily, you might need to find a hardware kit that supplies slider pins. In this case, these ones came out just fine and we should be able to lube them up and reinstall them with no problems. Remove the caliper, don't let it hang from the brake line or the brake hose. Set it up on the suspension so it has some support and not just hanging there. Using our 19mm 6-point socket, we're going to remove the caliper bracket from the spindle. I'm using a 1/2-inch drive with a swivel on it to remove it, but to install it I think I use a 3/8 drive, so make sure you grab a 3/8 drive before you go too far. I had to use a 1/2-inch breaker bar to get these bolts from the caliper off of the spindle. They were actually pretty tight. If you need any tools used to get this job done, make sure you look for a link in the description below to purchase those, as well as the parts such as the pads, hardware kit, the rotor. All that should be in the link below, or links in the description below to purchase those. Removing these bolts felt like forever. Thank God for video editing. We sped up this process by a lot. Remove both the bolts, set them off to the side. Your caliper bracket should fall right off, so make sure you're supporting it. Take a good look at it, make sure you see where your wear indicators are at on the pad, where it's placed at in the caliper housing right there. Remove the rotor, set it off to the side. Right here you're going to find the parking brake or the emergency brake assembly right under the rotor. You can adjust it using the star right there on the top. That'll expand the pads out or contract them in, depending on which way you turn that star. Sometimes these pads are worn out and you do need to replace them, but in this case they're just fine. The adjustment was done, looks like not too long ago. With some lube, the new parts and the old parts, gather everything together, clean all your old parts off, make sure everything is good for reinstallation, make sure you have no grease stuck on these slider pins, and before you install them, we're going to properly lube them up. Remove your pads, match them up with the new pads, make sure they look the same, make sure they have those quiet reducer or those pads on the back. If not, add grease if you'd like to do that. But just make sure your old pads look like your new ones. Set them off to the side. With the pads out, remove the old hardware kit and match it up to the new one just to make sure it looks similar before you put it on there and it's the wrong one. With the new hardware kit, it should clip right into place. You shouldn't have too much problem doing so, but sometimes hardware kits have a little pin or ear that needs to be pushed in or wrapped around the caliper so it doesn't rub on the rotor. So just make sure when you're installing it, you don't have anything on the caliper bracket rubbing on the rotor itself. Push them in nice and tight so they clip into place. Grab your clean slider pins and some caliper brake grease. Lube up your slider pins liberally. Don't be too shy on this. When you get everything lubed up, you're going to stick it in the same hole that you removed it from, so make sure you remember where it came out of. You want to make sure that the slider pin can move freely in and out of that bore with no restrictions at all. You don't want to have so much grease to where it's popping out of that boot. Also, make sure your boot is in good fashion, that it's not ripped, it doesn't look like it's going to fall apart anytime soon. If it is, you can find a kit that has the boots as well. Make sure everything's lubed up and it can slide freely. Don't want anything to hold the piston on the rotor too long. Get everything lubed up and grab the pads. Let's get ready to install all the new parts. Make sure you properly adjust your parking brake or e-brake. Slide the rotor on. You'll see that larger hole right here. That is a hole to adjust your parking brake or e-brake from outside of the rotor. So put your rotor on in place. Well, it doesn't really matter because you're going to turn it. Put the rotor on, put a lug nut on it, and see if it will spin. You want to set the friction of the parking brake or e-brake enough to get 3 spins, no more than 5, out of the rotor. So adjust it properly. Grab your brake caliper bracket and the retaining bolts. Install those. It doesn't matter if you install the top one or the bottom one first. Just make sure they're in. After you get everything finger tight, you're going to want to get your torque wrench. We're going to torque these bolts, these 19mm bolts, down to 62 foot-pounds. Make sure you get a good 3 clicks out of your torque wrench before you move on to the next. I do that with all of my bolts, not just these, but anything that's torqued down, I get a good 3 clicks out of it before I move on to the next. Again, that's a 19mm, 62 foot-pounds on the caliper bracket to spindle bolt. Before we go any further, we need to make sure we have the cap on the brake fluid reservoir open, so when we push the fluid back in, we don't blow any seals out. Retrieve the caliper, and you're going to need a caliper compression tool to get this job done. If you need one of these tools, make sure you look for a link in the description below to purchase one. There are a bunch out there. This one's really cheap, really easy to use. Grab an old brake pad, put it on the cylinder, or on the piston right there, sorry, and then get your compression tool to squeeze inside there and just tighten it up. Again, thank you God to the advancement of the technology of video editing, so you can see this thing going really quick. Push it all the way in as far as it could go. You should be able to get the piston to recess all the way into the caliper itself. Push it all the way in there. I will hold it for a second or two. I don't know if that really makes a difference, but it'll set there before I pull it out. I don't know why. Maybe it'll settle. I don't know. That probably doesn't make a difference at all. Set it back off to the side. Get your new brake pads and reinstall the brake pads in the fashion that you took them out. Hopefully you took some pictures when you were taking them out so you know where the wear indicator was placed. On the top, the bottom, and which pad. Shouldn't be that hard. Go ahead and install your new pads. When I get them pressed into the caliper bracket, I'll squeeze them pretty tight. Sometimes with the new hardware kit, they are a little hard to get to press into the bracket, but unless they're the wrong ones, they should go in. Again, make sure your slider pins are moving freely. Install the slider pins through the caliper and into that bracket itself. Get these finger tight, and again, we're going to want to get the torque wrench back out and properly torque down these bolts. These are going to be 14mm bolts. Preferably use a 6-point socket to tighten these down. These slider pins don't take too much oomph. Make sure it's properly greased and you don't have any ripped boots or anything.
32 foot-pounds.
Using my 3/8 torque wrench, I'm going to torque these 2 bolts, your caliper bolts, 14mm down to 32 foot-pounds. Doesn't matter if it's the top or bottom first, just make sure they're both properly torqued down. You might want to use a crescent wrench to hold the slider pins when you are torquing these down as well. Really, that is pretty much it. Here you have your new pads, your new rotors, and make sure you tighten up the cap on your fluid reservoir. Before you get going on your way, make sure you press on your brake pedal 3 to 5 times. Get that stiffness out of it before you go anywhere so you don't crash into anything. You can see on the front of this rotor it did have a missing cover, or a little rubber grommet was missing for the adjustment on the e-brake. If you have yours, put it in there. But other than that, hopefully this video helped you out. Make sure you comment below with the year, make, model of vehicle that this video did help you on. Hopefully one of these 2 videos will be your next hopeful video. And thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next hopefully helpful video.